Welcome and good afternoon. This webinar is part of the National Council of Churches Impact Week, wherein we are looking at various issues and concerns over the course of the week and seeing how we as church communities and as individual church members can do our part to make a difference. I am Tony Kyriopoulos, Associate General Secretary at the NCC, and I am pleased to moderate this session. And I am pleased further to have with us today three friends and colleagues who work on global issues that are of concern to the member churches of the NCC, among the many issues internationally with which we engage. I will introduce them collectively and then turn to them in order to bring us up to date on particular issues in their areas of expertise, and to offer to us one or two possible actions that each of us participating in this conversation can take to affect change. First, we'll hear from May Elise Cannon, who is the Executive Director at Churches for Middle East Peace. May and her team work on issues, as the name of the organization implies, in the wider Middle East. Their office is in Washington, D.C., where they can bring the collective voice of the churches together on issues that come before the U.S. government. For many years, I have been a board member, and now I am an officer on the executive committee, and I am proud to work with May and other CMEP colleagues on these issues. We'll then hear from Pavlo Smitsliuk, currently a fellow at Princeton University, who first was introduced to the NCC in the fall of last year, and who brought his firsthand experience in Ukraine to his presentation at our annual Christian Unity Gathering. He works closely with the churches in the region, and his insight will be invaluable as we learn today about the current situation in the war in the year and some months since the Russian invasion, the ongoing plight of the refugees, and the continued challenges to the churches there. Finally, we'll hear from Rick Santos, the President and CEO of Church World Service, the US-based humanitarian aid organization that is integral to the ecumenical community here in the US and critical to the global humanitarian assistance as a global partner of other such organizations worldwide. As many of you know, CWS and NCC were one organization at one time. The two organizations separated back in 1999 or 2000, around that time, so as to more effectively live out our respective mandates. Since that time, the organizations have remained close, and I am pleased that the NCC has CWS as a partner to whom we can turn when we are called upon to lift up global humanitarian concerns. In anticipation of their comments, I thank each of them, and I look forward to hearing from them. When introductory comments are finished, I will ask them to engage with one another as prompted by their presentations. And if there is time near the end of the session with all of you who are listening in, if you have any questions. My colleague, Keith Swartzendruber, and I will field the questions that come into the chat room or into the Q&A room so that they can be answered by our presenters. Thank you. And I also welcome Bishop Vashti Murphy-McKenzie, the General Secretary and President of the NCC.
Thank you, Tony. And thank everybody for joining us in our International Impact Day. And we're looking forward to your comments and sharing. Your voices are important to this work, and we praise God for you. And those of you who are on the webinar and listening in the virtual Digiverse. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. May, let's turn to you. Please speak to us about what is currently happening in Israel and Palestine and in other Mideast contexts which you wish to discuss.
Sure. So to give an overall summary of what's happening in the Middle East, it's a little beyond the scope of 10 minutes. So I'm going to highlight a few specific regions and a few of the frameworks that Churches for Middle East Peace uses as we engage in peace building and advocating for justice and peace throughout the whole Middle East. I won't have time to talk about the economic crisis in Lebanon or what's happening in Egypt or even Syria. And so I just want you to know I'm not not going to be covering it all, but I will be trying to give you a vast summary of several of the issues that we work on. At Churches for Middle East Peace, we now have 30 member communions, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, peace churches coming together who've agreed upon 13 policy positions. And I sometimes tease that it's a miracle for different denominational groups to agree on anything because we have so many differences. And so the fact that we come together with consensus on our policy positions, I think, is certainly an accomplishment. One of our main priorities in terms of advocacy in the Middle East is humanitarian and economic concerns. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what's happening in Yemen in that regard. Yemen currently has one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time. And what's interesting is it's not the most reported on. The World Health Organization, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and others have said that it's the world's largest humanitarian crisis. More than 17.2 million people living in Yemen right now are food insecure, and more than 2 million children under 5 years of age have acute malnutrition, with more than 500,000 suffering life-threatening illnesses because of being undernourished. More than 10,000 children have died already as a result of the war and the humanitarian crisis there. And so I wanted to highlight this as an example when we talk about our advocacy priorities. CMEP seeks to educate about crises like what's happening in Yemen. We look at the core causes of the conflict and how did the situation become so severe. In Yemen in 1990, there actually were two different countries, the Yemen Arab Republic in the north and the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen in the south. They were unified into a single country, and because those issues were unresolved, an ongoing civil war has existed since that time. And then you have the intervention of a Saudi-led coalition, and the Saudis started a blockade that has actually prevented needed resources from being able to enter into the country, which is part of what's caused such devastating humanitarian needs. I think it's important for us to understand the role that the U.S. has played in this humanitarian situation. The U.S. Previously supported the Saudi-led coalition by supporting and providing logistical support, intelligence sharing, but also fueling Saudi planes. And so there's been conversations in Congress about trying to stop the US support of the Saudi coalition, which is ultimately contributing to this humanitarian crisis. The good news is in 2022, there was a truce. The terms of that truce have since ended, but in large part, it's still being lived out where some of the attacks have stopped, some of the ports have been opened. And so we kind of see this unresolved geopolitical issue and this ongoing humanitarian crisis, which I wanted to start with that because one, it's so unknown, and two, because it is one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time. In addition to humanitarian and economic assistance, CMEP's advocacy priorities focus on holistic peace building, and a part of that is the protection of all religious groups, but also the sustainability of the Christian community in the Middle East. And many paid great attention to the attacks in northern Iraq and Kurdistan when ISIS was in control. In large part, the Christian community in Iraq feels like since ISIS was defeated from a military standpoint, that the Christian communities there now have been largely ignored. The Christian community in northern Iraq was significantly displaced. I had the opportunity to be with them in 2019, and I'll have the opportunity to be with them again next January. And in large part, many of those refugees, Christians and other minority groups like the Yazidis, have not yet returned back to their homes. And so one of the realities that we're seeing in northern Iraq and in Kurdistan is concerns about the sustainability of the Christian community there, even though ISIS, which is known as Daesh in Arabic, no longer controls the region or controls the territory. Another part of the Middle East, which technically geographically is in the Caucasus, but we work in this region significantly in Churches for Middle East Peace, is Armenia and Azerbaijan. And you might say, why would Churches for Middle East Peace work in Armenia? And it's because the Armenian community, which is a Christian community, sees itself as being a part of the Arab world. One of the 4 quadrants in the Old City of Jerusalem is a Christian, the Christian quadrant, but then you also have the Armenian quadrant in the Old City. And so CMEP has, as a part of our membership, the Armenian Orthodox Church. And so we work in Armenia, and Armenia has been at war with Azerbaijan since the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the surrounding regions were divided up to become future states. And Azerbaijan was given a piece of land that's called today Nagorno-Karabakh. And there's been a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in this area of Nagorno-Karabakh. I don't have time to pull out the maps and to go through all of the specifics of the conflict, but one of the things that Churches for Middle East Peace works on in that part of the world is the sustainability of the Christian community there. And I think as we're talking about Armenia, it's important to understand that the annihilation of the Christian community during the Armenian genocide in the early 1900s is a part of the contemporary history of the Armenian people. And so there's large concerns in this region of Nagorno-Karabakh that the Christian community there, which is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, is under threat. You might have seen in the news in September, after some of the recent escalations, that U.S. Representative Nancy Pelosi and a small delegation from Congress visited Armenia. I was there when she came to visit, and there were escalations on the border, and she was very, very outspoken that the U.S. should play a role in supporting the Armenian people. CMEP engages in peace building around the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict because of our strong ties with the Armenian Orthodox Church, and also because Armenia is the oldest Christian country in the world. And there are concerns about the Christian community being able to still live there in peace without threat of war. In 2021, President Biden became the first U.S. president to acknowledge the genocide of the Armenian people. It took 100 years for the U.S. to acknowledge that conflict. And so CMEP remains committed to fighting for Christian sustainability, for fighting for a just peace as it relates to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The Azerbaijanis and Armenians are currently in peace talks, and we have hope that there might be a negotiated settlement to that specific conflict. So economic, humanitarian assistance are some of our priorities, the sustainability of the church and holistic peace building. And then one of our primary advocacy priorities as it relates to the Middle East is that of human rights. And so I would be remiss to not talk about Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, which CMEP has historically been our primary point of engagement. On the ground this year, in the occupied Palestinian territories, Israeli forces have killed at least 156 Palestinians across Israel, the OPT, and in Gaza. About half of the casualties were civilians, including 26 children, according to media reports. Earlier this month, you might have heard the story of a village of Nebi Saleh, where a 3-year-old, Mohammed al-Tamimi, was killed by Israeli fire in a little village outside of Ramallah. It's important for us to acknowledge the human rights concerns and ongoing violation of human rights as settlements have continued to expand at a rate faster than even under the Trump administration. Earlier this year, the United States blocked a resolution at the United Nations opposing settlement expansions. Settlers returned to illegal settlement outposts just weeks ago, and thousands of more settlement unit plans are expected to be announced this week. You have probably been paying attention to what's been happening in Israel in terms of the Israeli government and the status of the judicial overhaul. We saw civil responses and reactions in Israel where Israelis were saying it was undemocratic to have this overhaul of their judicial system. And for Palestinians, they're saying this is a call for democracy, but a democracy only for Jewish Israelis. And so there's a lot of civil concerns in terms of the current government of Israel. Most of the weekends throughout 2023, tens of thousands, even exceeding 200,000 Israelis, protested Netanyahu's proposal to overhaul the judicial system. The expected impact of the changes includes the judicial system having no authority to overrule the Knesset, which is the parliamentary body in the Israeli government. Supporters of the overhaul claim that the courts have become increasingly leftist and no longer reflect Israeli society as the Knesset does. But opponents of the overhaul believe that such changes threaten Israeli democracy, and they're even going so far as calling Israel a dictatorship. The courts sometimes rule against settlers, enraging the right, and they rarely rule in favor of Palestinians, enraging and despairing Palestinians and their supporters. I just want to close by talking a little bit about what's happening on Capitol Hill in relationship to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And one of the ways, if you're interested in engaging with Churches for Middle East Peace, is that you could come alongside of us in advocating for these policy changes or for these resolutions. So HR 3103, the Palestinian Children and Family Act, was introduced again by Representative Betty McCollum in May. This is the fourth iteration of this legislation, and it's principally legislation advocating for Palestinian human rights so that U.S. military funding would not be used in support of the occupation, or that U.S. funding would not be used in support of human rights violations, including things like the detention of Palestinian children, annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank, the destruction of Palestinian homes and property. The bill would require that the State Department annually certify U.S. funds are not used for those purposes. The second legislation is HR 3477, which is the Justice for Shireen Act, which was introduced by Representative Carson in May. The legislation was introduced for the second time and required a report to Congress from the FBI and State Department in consultation with the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence in response to the killing of the Palestinian-American Christian journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed in May of 2022. The legislation currently has 10 sponsors. There's no active Senate legislation on this matter, but Senator Chris Van Hollen has been very vocal in calling for accountability to Shireen's killing. And finally, other issues we're tracking on Capitol Hill relate to those primary advocacy priorities of economic and humanitarian assistance, including that the U.S. would continue to fund UNRWA, the UN Refugee Workers Association, that provides educational, medical, and emergency relief services to the more than 5 million Palestinian refugees throughout the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. The legislation related to UNRWA is a part of an effort to seek to redefine who qualifies as a refugee, since we're now in subsequent generations of refugees. So that is just a bit of a snapshot from Armenia to Yemen. I'm a little bit out of breath. I'm sure that was quite a fire hose, but I wanted to share with you our priorities of economic humanitarian assistance, holistic peace building, the sustainability of the church in the Middle East, and advocating for human rights throughout the Arab world. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Thank you, May, very much. That was so very helpful. And I appreciated the little bits of things that we could do to really assist you and your work and the work for all people that work for peace in the Middle East. Thank you. So Pablo, let's now turn to you. The war in Ukraine continues to be horrific, and the news we get continues to be heartbreaking. Please shed some light on this dark situation for us.
Yes, thank you very much, Tony, for the invitation. What I would do is maybe give a little bit of introduction of how the churches and religions in Ukraine have reacted to this war, point out shortly the challenges that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine is living through, and then maybe raise the question of possible peace building. So the war in Ukraine is certainly like a horrible tragedy, which is not only local, but in a way of global nature. yes, the visit of several African presidents to Ukraine and Russia in these days is in a way a sign that what is going on in Ukraine affects many other countries across the globe. The challenge that the war in Ukraine constitutes is also a challenge for the understanding of the concept of just war and just peace. You have such an asymmetry, yes, between Russia, UN Security Council member, the biggest country in the world, attacking its smaller neighbor. Chechens struggle to remain pacifists in face of this conflict. Chechens also want to avoid escalation. Ukraine is a country with no major religion or church. There are several Orthodox churches who rites of Catholicism. There was an important Jewish population which has diminished during the Second World War, and some local Muslim population, especially in the south in Crimea. So it is more as US in terms of its religious pluralism compared to European countries. From the very start of the full-scale invasion by Russia, Ukrainian churches and religious organizations have condemned the war and have started helping everybody who needed their help. Millions of Ukrainian citizens have moved. Probably every third Ukrainian has left their house. Perhaps between 4 and 7 million went abroad, and a similar number of people moved internally. Thousands of church members and citizens have been murdered. Church buildings have been destroyed. Theological seminaries have been sacked. Priests have been killed and captured. I think more than 500 religious buildings have been destroyed. From the very first days of the war, Ukrainian churches, often with the assistance of their sister churches abroad in Europe and in the US, were engaged in helping those affected. As Archbishop Boris Gudzak, who is currently the Ukrainian Bishop of Philadelphia, but who is often in Ukraine, said, being with people, praying for people. Yes, this was what the churches did. This massive migration, internal and external, also became a sign of ecumenism. In a way, people escaping from the east of the country would be often Orthodox, moving to the west of the country, which is predominantly Eastern Catholic. Many Ukrainian families in Europe have been hosted by Catholic or Protestant churches. As Poland, Germany were among the countries that hosted most Ukrainians, especially in the first months of war. So you had this, in a way, ecumenical hospitality, Orthodox received by Catholic Protestant brothers. Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Western Ukraine, where I used to work, gave the premises of its theology faculty to host the refugees. So you had this unity of the churches, which is beautiful, of course. At the same time, the war, in a way, accelerated the crisis within Ukrainian Orthodoxy. Ukraine had a traditionally Orthodox church dependent on the Patriarchate of Moscow, with tensions between Ukraine and Moscow becoming stronger, in 2019, there was an Orthodox Church of Ukraine created and recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. So when the full-scale invasion has started, the two biggest religious organizations in Ukraine were Orthodox churches in competition. Now, Russian invasion and the justification of this invasion by the Russian Orthodox Church became a huge challenge for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was part of Patriarchate of Moscow. Yes, you remember the statements of Patriarch Kirill, yes, who blessed this war, who said that Russian soldiers killing Ukrainians will have their sins forgiven, and other really blasphemous statements. You can imagine under which pressure the church which belonged to this Patriarchate of Moscow found itself under. As months and months of war passed, there was a huge pressure of Ukrainian government and civil society on the church in unity with Moscow Patriarchate to clearly break communion and its dependence from Moscow. This has taken several forms. Government ordered searches of Ukrainian Orthodox Church UOC properties, terminated the lease of Kiev Pechersk Lavra, the huge monastery in Kiev, revoking citizenship to some clergy found in possession of Russian passports, putting several bishops under house arrest, imposing economic sanctions against Russian Orthodox clerics, and perhaps most importantly, drafting a law proposal prohibiting religious organizations with an affiliation with Russia. Of course, these actions of Ukrainian government are understandable because Ukraine is facing such a huge challenges. However, if certain things are pushed too far, that might represent a challenge for religious freedom in Ukraine. And I think there is a need of a lot of, I think, wisdom, patience, and prudence there. The primate of Ukrainian Greek Catholics, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, has questioned the wisdom of banning this Russia-affiliated church, saying that banning a church will not lead to its disappearance. Yes, Soviet Union in a way has taught people how to live and practice their faith in clandestinity. But you see that it's a question. It's a difficult question. Finally, some thoughts on peace building. I think that the churches should be prophetic voices in midst of this war. Over the past 3 decades, when Ukraine had its religious freedom, the churches mainly focused on building or rebuilding their structures, parishes, seminaries after communist persecutions. So in a way, they are still discovering and creating their theologies. They are still learning how to be present in the social life. They're still learning how to promote peace building. I think even if most Ukrainians believe that at this moment, any active peace building with Russia and with Russians is precautious, I think the church, first of all, can prepare themselves for this. And at the same time, they can help 2 Orthodox jurisdictions to reconcile. So I think there are at least 2 levels, 2 conflicts where religious peace building could take place at the intra-Orthodox level and between Ukraine and Russia. Those two conflicts, inter-Orthodox and between Ukraine and Russia, are strictly related, yet clearly distinguishable. What can be done? I think, first of all, churches can assist the society at large in preventing hatred. Hatred is a natural companion of every war. I think Ukrainian churches and intellectuals can help resisting both collectively blaming of all Russians for the aggression against Ukraine and blaming all the members of the Orthodox Church for being supportive of this war. I think this is very important. Ukrainians tend to blame Russians because, as statistics shows, the majority of Russian population supports this invasion. However, it's very difficult also to assess statistics in a country which is has authoritarian characteristics and which is at war. What remains, I think, the fact that no bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church inside Russia has protested. Very few protests by Russians against this war have been observed. At the same time, the responsibility should be considered as personal. Of course, as Hannah Arendt has once said, that every job in a society of certain importance, yes, a football player or journalist or a teacher in a kindergarten, allow the system to function. At the same time, this responsibility is personal. The enemy should not be dehumanized, and there must be some space for Christian life, Christian love, even in the midst of war. Thank you very much for your attention.
Tony, you're muted.
Sorry. I was thanking you, Pavla, for that a wonderful discourse. And I appreciated the light that you shed in the darkness about the ecumenical relationships between the Catholic Orthodox and others that are providing such assistance to the refugees who are suffering, certainly among the most there in Ukraine. And I also appreciated what we can do in terms of trying to stop the blame and the hate that's resulting from all of this conflict. Okay, Rick, let's turn to you now. Syria and Turkey continue to suffer from the consequences of the terrible earthquake that took place some months ago. How have humanitarian aid organizations been able to handle that devastation? And since CW works in so many contexts, what other areas and concerns, say in Latin America and the Caribbean, or at the US southern border and parts of Africa and South Asia, what else should be on our radar screens?
Well, thank you, Tony. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel today. I'll make a couple of pivots during my presentation, so I will make sure to let people know as I make that pivot. First of all, just a little bit about Church World Service. We, as you mentioned earlier, we are an organization. Our mission is about just and sustainable approaches to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. We were founded over 76 years ago and have had some version of that portfolio mix the entire 76 years. We are really committed to approaches around partners and partnership, partners, local community, other ecumenical organizations, local organizations, And, you know, there's a lot of actually conversation today around, there's a term that's being used called localization. In fact, you know, we as part of Church World Service and a lot of our member church bodies have been practicing something called accompaniment, and a kind of a version, probably a very good model of localization for decades. So it's something that we do as an organization and something that we're committed to. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. You know, on February 6th, it was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck the border regions between Turkey and Syria. It was probably the most devastating earthquake in terms of lives lost, really since the Haiti earthquake in 2010. And just to bring some context to that, I was actually in Haiti for that the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and my previous organization was responded to that. So I think there's some real lessons learned in terms of what's going on right now in Turkey and Syria, and what we learned from the earthquake in Haiti. So in terms of some of the support that's done, we as Church World Service are supporting two of our main ecumenical partners. In terms of response, we are not responding on the ground ourselves directly. The International Orthodox Christian Charities is one of our long-term partners, and they are responding on the ground, as well as the ACT Alliance. We do a lot of international response with and through the ACT Alliance. And so really, you know, a lot of, I would say, a combination right now of different phases of a disaster. And I think to understand a disaster and how we respond, you have to understand each phase. So the first phase is really the most acute phase, and that's really about getting in there and saving lives. And so that what that means is, you know, pulling people out of the rubble, emergency medical care, emergency water, emergency food, shelter, things like that are needed almost immediately when any type of large natural disaster happens. So that phase really is probably the shortest phase. It's probably about, frankly, 1 week to maybe a month. Especially on saving lives. Really, I mean, I know there were some really amazing stories of people being pulled out of the rubble 3 weeks after the earthquake struck, and that's amazing. But usually the life-saving part of that, the immediate life-saving part of that, happens actually in the immediate aftermath of any disaster. So, you know, and just an interesting observation about that, you know, most of the money that's raised for disaster is raised in that first week or 2 weeks of any disaster. But actually, in fact, the most money that's needed is in the later phases of the disaster. There's only so much that can be done in that initial phase. You get a lot of people coming in from a lot of different agencies, different organizations, the UN, other governments. And so, you know, really, that part of the phase, that phase of a disaster, really a lot of money comes in, a lot of attention, a lot of activity, a lot of life-saving activities going on. And then really when that piece is done, the news cameras go away. But that's really in some ways where a lot of the longer term, harder work that needs to be done. And I would say really clearly from the Haiti earthquake, a good lesson that was learned was it really, you know, after that really kind of immediate acute phase, and then you kind of go just literally in the stabilization phase, which is essentially trying to help people kind of just make the adjustment. Especially we saw the pictures in Turkey and in Syria, but also, frankly, and it reminded me so much of the Haiti earthquake, where the buildings had collapsed, people's homes are gone. You know, how do you address kind of that kind of chronic homelessness that will be in place for many years? So this kind of initial phase is sorting that out, still giving some emergency and other needs. And then you go into, and we're not quite there yet in the Turkey and the Syria right now, but that longer term rebuilding phase. And what does that take? And if Haiti is any lesson, you know, that took a decade. And so one of the big challenges of any disaster, much like what happened in Turkey and Syria, is that how do you keep people's interest? How do you keep the support at a high level, especially when the actual rebuilding piece takes such a long time? So again, we as Spiritual Service, supporting our local partners, local communities and churches in the affected areas. And really, for us, one of our biggest things, since we're not a direct implementer on the ground, is to try to continue to build support and to build, keep that energy and momentum going for that response. So that just kind of a very I would say a high level view of this type of situation and how we respond. But I'm going to use this moment to take a little bit of a pivot, and it's really I think the panel is just Tony. I think you really did a great job pulling people together, because I think things that May talked about and things that Pavlo talked about really relate to where my pivot's going, and that is around the issue of refugees. So, coming out of oftentimes natural disasters, I mean, May talked about the Yemen situation in Yemen. We see it very clearly in the situation in Ukraine. Natural disasters do create a bit of displacement, but the largest kind of epicenters of displacement are conflicts and more complex emergencies. And so, just to put into context, in Turkey, Turkey itself, when it's going through all this incredible situation, actually has 3.7 million refugees in its own country, within its borders. Turkey is actually one of the countries that host some of the most number of refugees in the world. So, so as I'm pivoting to this, I want to put the situation of both the disaster, but also these longer term emergencies into perspective. Today, based on UNHCR numbers, there's over 103 million forcibly displaced people around the world. Of that number, about 53 million are internally displaced. So in a natural disaster, people cross borders, but most likely they're going to stay within the boundaries of their own country. Of that, approximately 32 million are actually refugees, so they've crossed an international boundary. And of that number, of that 103, about 5 million are asylum seekers, which is a different, in the refugee world, it's a different kind of legal definition. But actually, of all of those groups, only about 1 million, so less than 1%, actually ever get resettled. So we're talking about, a situation in the world where we have over 100 million people who have been on the move or migrated or not in their homes. And they're really, it is just a truly, I would say, a tragic situation. And sometimes my concern is that the world hasn't responded to this situation as well as it could. Just to give you a few other numbers here, of those 103 million, 72% approximately come from about 5 countries. So those countries include the ones we just talked about: Syria, 6.8 million refugees because of conflict have left the country. Venezuela, approximately 5.6. Ukraine, now approximately 5.4 million. Afghanistan, 2.8. And South Sudan, approximately 2.4 million. So, refugees, Pavlo talked about, the situation in the churches and I think the response and that dynamic, but a secondary dynamic was essentially where people who left Ukraine, who fled for their lives, where they go. They mostly went to the border states. So most of that number is actually in Europe. Some have come to the US. That in terms of our global refugees and what we're trying to do and try to respond, that is just a massive global problem. And then it's being exacerbated. So we know that natural disasters, as we talked about, like an earthquake, causes refugees to happen and internally displaced. We also know that complex emergencies do as well. But what I think is what we don't put enough kind of emphasis on is that climate change will be a place that will be driving these migration numbers even more in the future. And we think some of the weather-related displacement is being exacerbated by global climate change. So I'm going to do another little pivot to the U.S. In the U.S., we resettled. The Biden administration has now, through its presidential determination, said that we would take in 125,000 refugees. It's, of course, as with the other numbers I just shared with you, it's a small amount, but it's much more than it was in the previous administration. The Biden administration has done a really, I would say, an admirable job trying to rebuild the refugee pipeline. And of course, last year, we had really the two big inflows of refugees into the country that were essentially outside of the normal refugee resettlement pipeline. Those were Ukrainians and Afghanis. So people who came in because of those emergencies that we, kind of pushed up the number of people coming. It actually brought the numbers, even though the pipeline wasn't ready for that 125. We actually, those numbers helped increase the pipeline for that year. So just wanting to kind of talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of programs in the US for resettling of refugees. And again, it's such a small portion. And I think really the lesson here is that in order to address larger flows of internally displaced and refugees, that we actually have to work in those contexts where those refugees are coming from. I think the big lesson now, and I'm doing another kind of slight pivot again, and that's around the US southern border. The refugee situation that we address here in the US really comes from the global context. And the migration pathways through Central America, we know that the largest number of refugees coming into the US at this point are Venezuelans, but there's also a lot of Cubans, Haitians, and part people from the Northern Triangle, so Honduras and Guatemala. And so, the question is, what is driving all of that? What is the epicenter of all of that? And so, for people to make that incredibly dangerous move to leave their country, to leave their home, to leave their family, right? To go through really possibly life-threatening challenges to actually just get to the border. That what's driving it has to be severe. And so the US has been, I think, trying to do the best that it can around these numbers. As Church World Service, we're doing a lot of work with children. We're doing it's called home services and post-relief services for unaccompanied children who come across the border. We're building that program up. We're trying to address when people come over, they need shelters. We have a shelter network. We're building our larger US kind of network so that we're able to receive more people, but also to provide more services for them. And so maybe I'll close by saying, one of the things that one of the questions, Tony, I think was, what can people do? So I think in the first part, I would say that people, in terms of natural disasters like Turkey and Syria, and like we learned in Haiti, people can stay with it for a long time. That you need to actually continue to follow, to understand what's going on, and to actually be generous and provide resources. On the larger kind of displacement, the global refugee numbers, the global migration numbers, that 103 million. I think what people can do is also really, I would say, advocate on behalf of those people. There's a lot of things that we can do as a country to maybe help stabilize regions as opposed to destabilize them. That will kind of keep those migration flows less. But also, I would say that we can continue to advocate here in the US around accepting refugees and really making that part of welcome. We are a country. Our Christian faith really says welcome is a big part of who we are. It's our identity, whether it be from the Bible or from the Statue of Liberty. I mean, we really have been a country of welcome, and we need to continue to be. And I think also on the southern border, I think we can really, it goes a long way to tell that narrative, to tell that story, that people are really in desperate need. They're trying to escape areas. They're trying to escape from really just horrible situations. And when they come here, and I met a lot of refugees over the last year, and they are people who care about their family, care about their communities. They provide resources in our economy. They work. They are really just part of our community, and they make our community richer. So I would just say, something else people can do is welcome the stranger, welcome the newcomers to our country. I know I probably went a little over, but thank you for this time.
Thank you, Rick. Wow, those numbers are sobering. And as a listener, I don't know if I should be more disheartened or heartened by the work that you and others do to help alleviate such suffering in the world. So thank you. I'd like to ask if anybody has any questions. I don't see any yet in the chat or the Q&A, but in the meantime, one of our board members and former chair of the NCC, Archbishop Deacon Ikazian, who's also now the vice moderator of the WCC, the World Council of Churches, wanted to add a comment as well. He comes from the Armenian Orthodox Church that May had spoken about. And so I'd like to welcome him just to say a couple of words as we near the end of our time together. Your Eminence.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I know I wasn't on the agenda. Anyhow, I would like to express my thanks to the panelists. Their presentation was excellent. Special thanks goes to Reverend Cannon, who mentioned Armenia, and she took a group to Armenia to visit, to see the situation on the spot. And of course, I mean, based on what I've been hearing recently, the Armenia, Karabakh is expecting a second genocide. This is the statements from the International Christian Organization of Europe. I'm not going to speak about Armenia, but I want to speak a little bit about Ukraine. I think Dr. Paulo, there is no just peace. There is no just war, Dr. Paulo. There is just peace, but not just war. Some scholars have in the past also expressed this kind of ideas, just war. I don't think that anybody who sees the reality won't be angry with Russia or Putin. When you see on TV the destruction of villages, when you see hundreds of thousands of millions of women and children being displaced from one place to another, from Ukraine to other countries, it's heartbreaking. It's terrible. It's terrible. But I want to remind you as well, I was with the top leader of World Council of Churches to visit, very small group visit to Ukraine. And we met with the authorities and with the churches, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, etc., and other church leaders. We have condemned the interference of Russian Orthodox Church in these affairs. But it doesn't mean that we should not condemn when the Ukrainian government is pushing against a church that was under the jurisdiction of Russian Patriarchate for 150 years. The same church, which is called Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has made a statement condemning the war, and then they are saying that we have nothing to do with Russian Orthodox Church. So instead of bringing these two sides together, the government of Zelensky is supporting the Orthodox Church of Ukraine against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This division could be healed if they leave the church affairs to the church, not the government. It's not a politics. This is what the World Council of Churches is doing. We convinced both sides, and we spoke with the Ecumenical Patriarchate also, that we are going to have a roundtable meeting in Switzerland sometime in September, inviting the side and try to have a conversation, a dialogue. This is the way to solve the problem, not by forcing one group against the other. This is I think we should follow very, very closely. Number three.
Just one more, because we have to close it.
Okay. But number three, that I just want to remind you that the churches have done a lot of help. The ACT Alliance, the Roman Catholic Church, Vatican, and still they are supporting the refugees, the displaced people, the people in need in Ukraine and other part of countries around Ukraine. Thank you, Tony. I'm sorry I'm not in the I wasn't on the list, but this is a very important subject. So I was.
Well, thank you. And thank you for bringing the international ecumenical perspective to these issues. And I know that there may be some difference of opinion as far as how to heal certain wounds and resolve certain conflicts, as in Ukraine, but nevertheless, we are all of one mind that it has to end, that it was unjust and a horrible invasion to begin with, and that we pray for the Ukrainian people, as we pray for the Middle Eastern minorities and others in that region, and all of the places that Rick mentioned as well. So I want to thank our three panelists for their excellent presentations. And I want to thank everybody who was listening in. Our time has come to an end, so I don't see any questions on there. So we're not skipping anybody. So I'm glad for that we're not skipping anyone. So I want to thank you all, those who were listening in, but especially I want to thank May, Elise Cannon, Pavlo Smitsniuk, and Rick Santos for their illuminating presentations. Thank you especially for helping us to see what actions we might take as individuals and communities to help alleviate these concerns of the human family. On behalf of the National Council of Churches, I wish everybody well, and I wish you all a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.